On July 31st, 1994, a wildfire burned this area behind me. This area had been a dense timber stand that had grown with unnatural fuel accumulations as a result of fire suppression activities over an 80-year period or so. What happened when this wildfire moved into this stand is it ran up into the crowns of trees by climbing up fuel ladders that were there, and by so doing it started running through these crowns, torching them out, sending burning embers off ahead of the fire itself and creating numerous spot fires. This fire burnt with very high intensity. In fact, an intensity which is unusual for an area that is in a dry habitat type such as this. Normally, if this area had been in a more natural condition, we would expect a fire to behave a lot differently and to maybe torch out some of these trees, but not to have blackened and crowned out and killed this whole stand of trees. In order to try to deal with this type of situation, we have, over the last 10 years or so, been trying to prescribe burn out in these areas where we take several hundred acres a year and we run fire through them generally during the springtime when there's a lot of moisture in the ground and prior to the trees budding, in order to remove some of the fuel accumulations such as we have here. Now, when this fire was going, the only way to put this out, there was no way to attack this with by hand or to attack this using the engines that were on scene. The only way that this could be dealt with is through the retardant ships that were called in that dropped retardant on this fire, and through water bucket drops from helicopters. Now, if you contrast this area to the area over to our left here, where we had prescribed burn the previous spring, you'll notice a big difference in the way that the vegetation responded, and there was a tremendous difference in the way that the fire reacted when it got over into this area. Unlike the area that had been untreated, which burnt with very high intensity and moved very fast, the area that had been treated burned with much lower intensities and the rate of spread was much lower. This allowed firefighters to come in and to be able to attack it on the ground and to put this fire out, as opposed to needing the use of retardant ships or the use of water drops from helicopters. The fire, as it burned through here, as I mentioned, stayed on the ground. It did not climb up into the crowns of these trees and torch them out. If it would have done that, the intensity of the fire would have increased and we could have had a crown fire burning through here. But because the area had been thinned out, because we had prescribed burned it, it eliminated the conditions that allow for a fire to burn with that intensity. And those are some of the reasons that we try to do the prescribed burning out in this area. It helps to reduce the potential for wildfires and the potential for destruction of homes and lives. Well, if you don't prescribe burn, you set up some unnatural conditions so that in the future, at some time when a wildfire does start, it burns unnaturally. For instance, in these types of habitats, which are drier, ponderosa pine type habitats, fire has been a natural part of this ecosystem. Usually anywhere from every 5 to 20 years, you would get a ground fire that would move through this area. It would burn relatively cool. It would torch out a few trees, but for the most part, it would move along the ground, consume some of the ground fuels, actually help to rejuvenate some of the browse, and have, for the most part, positive effects. This is where we see a lot of the pine stands that tend to have a park-like appearance to them. And that's how we think that a lot of these stands existed around here in the past before we started suppressing wildfires. Now, it's been about the last 80 years or so that we've suppressed wildfires very actively, especially down in the valley bottoms where people lived. And what's happened as a result of that is we've interrupted maybe as many as 5 or 6 fire cycles, where ordinarily we would have had cool burns moving through these stands. So what's happened instead is we've grown denser stands of trees. We've grown stands where there's ladder fuels now, and by ladder fuels I mean smaller fuels or fuels that are hanging down from the branches of trees that allow those fires then to be carried up into the crowns of trees and create a lot more damage than what would occur under natural conditions. So one of the purposes of prescribed burning is simply to try to get these areas into a more natural condition so that when wildfires do start, they play the normal role that they would have played, which usually would not be life-threatening or would not destroy a lot of property in the process. And for the most part, accomplish some very good objectives for the ground.
Well, we use prescribed fire for a variety of reasons, and probably 2 primary ones. One is for hazard reduction, because we know fire is a natural thing in the environment, and it's going to happen sooner or later, and so by prescribed burning we can kind of beat nature to the punch and take care of it before she does it when we can't control it. From a vegetative aspect, for prescribed burning, it restores the nutrients back into the soil, and all the shrubs, almost every plant species in this area, be it grass or shrubs or whatever, will respond to fire, and they all resprout from fire. You know, fire is a natural part of the history of this area, and so all these plants developed with fire. So the fire really doesn't kill the shrubs or plants, it just actually rejuvenates them is what it does. And like I say, with the fertilizing of the ashes, it helps, gives more nutrients to the plants, and they actually respond really well. We've had plant species that have been almost dormant for 20, 30 years, and then after a prescribed burn they come back and really flush, and the game just chomps on them.
Some of the issues that we're faced with prescribed burning, and perhaps the biggest one, is the smoke that it generates. Obviously no one likes to be breathing in smoke, and the mere fact that we're going out and doing this on purpose is very difficult for many people to understand. There's also a visual effect that comes with it. As you can see in looking at this stand, many of the needles are red. It gives the bark on the trees has been blackened, and it gives the appearance that a fire has moved through the area. And at least for several years afterwards, it does give that visual appearance. But over time, those effects go away, and the appearance is much more natural. Another issue that we face is people are worried that fires will get out of control. And that's obviously, there's no guarantees that you could always control a fire, but prescriptions are written for each one of these fires that try to set the conditions under which they will occur. And when conducted under prescription, the chances of a fire escaping or causing a major problem are very small. So we try to take every step possible to minimize the potential for an escaped fire. In this case, because we burned in the spring, moisture levels were still very high. The chances for a fire escaping and burning up large areas of land was extremely small.
One thing that people think is bad about prescribed burning is the costs involved, and it's true that prescribed burning does cost money to deal with, but in the long run, prescribed burning costs are far much cheaper than a wildfire. You know, we can treat areas like this here for, oh heck, $10 to $30 an acre at the most in places, and get a wildfire in this stand right here. If we were get a wildfire in the stand before this stand was when it was all the thicker trees and stuff, most of our wildfire costs today are averaging $1,000 an acre. So they're very expensive, and it's far cheaper to treat them with prescribed fire. Now when we do get a wildfire started in here, they're easier to suppress, and the cost would be a lot cheaper. So in the long run, they are a cost savings project, but it's hard for people to understand that. They think we're out here just spending money, and that's not really true.
After the wildfire occurred, we had some folks that came and talked to us about how they had reevaluated their positions and what they thought about prescribed burning. And some folks indeed have changed their minds, or at least recognize the importance of reintroducing fire into the environment if done properly.
I hated the Forest Service prescribed burn policy. I didn't see any reason for it. It made the valley so terribly smoky in the springtime when it was supposed to be beautiful. We'd pray for windy days so they couldn't burn. And I couldn't understand why it had to be that way, because when I was a kid, it didn't have to be that way. I just couldn't understand why they had to go out and burn every year when for years we got by without burning, and I hated it. I have to honestly admit, when we first heard the smoke, you know, there's smoke, and we saw the smoke, my first thought was, oh my Lord, there's so many houses over there. And then my second thought was, God, I hope that prescribed burn works. It's not going to, but I hope it works. And I just kept hoping that it would, because there's so many houses. And so my husband works for the city of Rexford, and the next night we had to go in and check the well. So he asked me, the Rexford well is way out that way, and he asked me, he said, you want to ride with me and see the fire? And I said, yeah, if they'll let me in. So they let us through so he could check the well. And you drive along toward the well where all the prescribed burning started, and it was like the fire just was raging, and it just shut down right there, just shut down. And my first thought was, Lord, I'm going to have to let Ron Hvizdak know that he was right. That was my very first thought. It's real obvious to me now. It has to be, because back when I was a kid, as Ron has so many times told me, nature took care of the burn. But now it doesn't, because it's so managed. And when they burn in the spring, I'm going to gripe like crazy about the smoke. But if anybody says anything to me, I'm going to say the same thing I said last night. It has to be. It has to be. We don't have to like the smoke, but it has to be.